Howdy, it's Kyle talking about Milwaukee. In this video, I'll be going over various aspects of the geography of the city. I'll be talking about the downtown and many other neighborhoods, the parks, beaches, walkability, bikeability, and public transit, economic indicators to include companies headquartered in the city and housing costs. But I will also go over some of the negative aspects of the city as well to include the high crime and poverty rates. Milwaukee is often considered one of the worst cities in the country. Is that the case? Well, if you're interested in learning more about the Cream City, this is the video for you. Milwaukee is the largest city in Wisconsin. It has a population of about 570,000 people, which ranks it the 31st largest city in the U.S. The population of the city is declining, and it was declining pre-pandemic as well. Milwaukee County has about 930,000 people, and the county is losing population. And the greater Milwaukee metro area, which is essentially all of southeastern Wisconsin, has just over 2.2 million people. That ranks it as the 33rd largest metro in the US, but do keep in mind that I put Kenosha County with Milwaukee metro and not Chicago metro, even though the Census Bureau puts it with Chicago. But in reality, it's one basic Lake Michigan megalopolis, so it doesn't make that much of a difference, but it does make the Milwaukee metro area a little bit larger than it would be without it. The shape of the city is very north-south oriented, with the entire eastern part of the city being on the Lake Michigan shoreline. The Milwaukee River runs right through downtown, dividing downtown between West Town and East Town. The central business district is the eastern central part of the city right along the lake, and there's a really nice lakefront trail that goes up and down basically the entire lakeshore through the entire city, including right through downtown. Running right along the Milwaukee River is the Riverwalk, and this is a long paved walking trail that runs right through all of downtown. East Town is where you have most of the big high-rises, and right along the lake shore in this part of the city is the large Veterans Park. On the west side of the river is West Town, and this has a big entertainment district along 3rd Street. This is where you have a lot of the city's nightlife, some bars and restaurants, and it can get pretty lively and rowdy there on the weekends. Also in this part of town is the fairly new arena for the NBA Milwaukee Bucks. Also in West Town is the gentrified brewery district. With Milwaukee having a large German heritage, there are a couple of big German-type businesses in the West Town area. One is a restaurant called Mater's, and when I first went in there, it looks very thematic. The servers are all wearing costumes. I wasn't quite sure if this was going to be any good. My wife's late father was from Germany, and she's been there many times. I texted her a photo of the menu and the meal that I ordered, and she's like, that was pretty authentic looking. So despite the touristy look to the place, and it being right in the part of town where many tourists go, it really is an authentic German restaurant. Also in the same part of town is Ussinger's Sausage, and it wouldn't be Wisconsin if there wasn't a big cheese shop in this part of town as well. Some other interesting parts of town include the historic 3rd Ward, which is the southeasternmost part of downtown. This area sits right along the lakefront and is where the really nice Milwaukee Public Market is. This part of town has been largely gentrified, a lot of art galleries, and a lot of it is upscale as well. Another area being gentrified is called Bronzeville. This is an area just north of downtown and historically was home to the middle class and upper class of the black community. However, in the mid-20th century, when they were building interstates, of course they built it right through the black neighborhood and separated the whole area. And after the interstates were built, property values in that area plummeted. And as a result, most of the middle and upper class black people in the neighborhood moved to some of the white neighborhoods and left the poor black folks behind. So this area deteriorated more and more, and when you have a high concentration of poverty in one area, you're going to have high crime as well. But there has been some gentrification going on in this neighborhood. But unlike most other black neighborhoods that are being gentrified, they're trying to keep the cultural tradition of this neighborhood alive. And to this day, the neighborhood is still a prime area for black-owned businesses. An area north of downtown is called River West, which is on the west bank of the river in the north part of the city. And this was an area that was pretty rough around the edges up until fairly recently. There have been some people moving in, some gentrification of older homes. And the area is still a little rough around the edges, but a lot of hipsters are coming in there. It's got some funky shops. It's not too far from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee campus. So I would call it kind of an up-and-coming neighborhood. But being right there along Lake Michigan, there are some nice beaches as well. The main beach in the heart of downtown is called Bradford Beach, and this is the big hangout beach. It can be pretty crowded on summer weekends, but there are many other beaches along the lakeshore, none of which are going to be as busy as Bradford. Similar to Chicago, many of the museums are located right along the lakefront, and these include the really cool looking art museum, the science museum, and children's museum. In terms of getting around the city, I would say it's pretty good for walkability. It's a fairly large city, but you're probably not going to be walking around in the northwestern quadrant or the southwestern corner of the city. But in terms of the central part of the city and basically the entire eastern half of the city, it's pretty good for walking. It's also a pretty decent city for biking. This map shows official biking trails throughout much of the city. It's kind of hard to see, but the main one is that pink one that goes around through most of this map. This is the Oak Leaf Trail, which has about 100 miles of multi-use paths. It goes through a lot of wooded areas, and through a good chunk of it you're going to be in green space. So I always think it's pretty nice when you can have something like this where you're still in the heart of the city, but it doesn't feel like you are. So it's pretty decent for walking and biking. What about public transit? It's considered a pretty good transit system for a big city. So you could look at some of these rankings done by urban planners and see that Milwaukee turned out pretty well. It's 24 on this list, but many of the ones in front of it are different parts of the same metro, like New York and Jersey City, San Francisco and Oakland, Los Angeles and Long Beach. So even though it's ranked 24th on this list, it's going to be top 20 in terms of overall metro areas. Something fairly new that they have there is a streetcar called the Hop. It's only been open for a few years and it's fairly limited in where it goes, but they are expanding its routes. The streetcar is electric and it's 100% free, so it's very convenient to have something like this to easily get around downtown and just hop on, hop off wherever you want. So, what about the economy of Milwaukee? What are some of the biggest things going on there? There are several major corporations headquartered there, including Harley-Davidson, Rockwell Automation, Northwestern Mutual, and Manpower Group. And in the suburb of Brookfield, immediately to the west, is where you have the corporate headquarters of Fiserv, Milwaukee Tools, and Kohl's department stores. Miller Beer is also headquartered in Milwaukee, but the ownership situation with that is pretty strange. It's owned by a multinational corporation, but it's still run in Milwaukee. I don't know, but Miller is in Milwaukee. So that's a decent list of large companies headquartered in the city or the immediate suburbs, but not everything with the economy is great. Of the 100 largest cities in the U.S., Milwaukee has the 11th lowest household income, and there's also a 25% poverty rate, which ranks it second worst of big cities in the U.S. And wherever you find a large concentration of poverty, you're going to find a concentration of crime as well. Generally speaking, the areas north and northwest of downtown are the poorest areas with the highest crime rates, but the farther you get to the outer ends of the city where it touches some of the suburbs or the lake, it's much nicer. But there are serious problems in the north side of the city with drugs and gangs. And those are the two things that lead to high crime rates in cities. But just like with most other cities, the media are going to focus on the negative things, are going to really overemphasize the crime. Whenever I talk about this subject, I don't want it to seem like I think the media are lying. These places are actually low crime, but they tend to overemphasize the crime and really sensationalize it and almost never bring up anything positive about these cities. So, Milwaukee has a nice downtown, a bunch of other really good neighborhoods. It's good for walking, biking, and public transit, nice parks and beaches, but it does also have some high crime. So, what does it cost to live there? So one thing I like to do is just go through some home listings and get some general ideas of what you can get in different parts of the city. This one here is what I call a baseline house. It's pretty cheap, it needs some work, and it's in kind of a rough around the edges neighborhood, but only $130,000. This house here I think is a steal, $150,000 for a good sized place. This is in that River West neighborhood, which still is a little rough in some areas, but it's really up and coming, and you can see what's been done to this house. Many houses in this part of town has had some of this other kind of renovation done to it, and this neighborhood is getting much more expensive and becoming more gentrified. And I would be shocked if you're able to get a house like this in Milwaukee for $150,000 in 5 years. This is going into a much more established, nicer neighborhood. It needs a decent amount of work, but it's well under $200,000. Here's a good sized house in a good neighborhood that doesn't need much work for only $220,000. This one here is at the edge of town, the part of town where it's almost like suburbs in the city. Good sized house, nice house, doesn't need much work, very reasonable price. And now you're getting up into somewhat upscale for Milwaukee, and this is a very low price for that. Big house, nice neighborhood, quiet street, doesn't need much work. This house in an equivalent neighborhood in Chattanooga would be well over $500,000. However, look at those property taxes. And then I wanted to show this one as kind of a top tier house for Milwaukee. This thing is huge. It's in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city on a really quiet street, only a couple of blocks from the lakeshore. And yeah, this is really expensive, but where in the US are you getting a house like this in that type of a neighborhood for 800? But those property taxes are frightening. So that's my overview of Milwaukee. Is it one of the worst cities in the country, as you'll often hear? Well, I would say compared to all of the other big cities in the US, it comes off pretty average. But compared to just the other older Midwestern and Northeastern cities, I would say it's maybe below average a little bit. But I do like the city. Of the top 50 cities in the country, there are only about 15 I don't like, and Milwaukee is not one of those. And it does have high crime and high poverty, but it isn't all the doom and gloom that the media often report it as. And the city is very inexpensive despite the high taxes. But with a time right now where the Sun Belt and suburbs are becoming so expensive, you can get a nice house in a Midwestern city like Milwaukee in a good neighborhood for pretty cheap. So perhaps we'll see in the next 10 years or so populations start to grow again in some of these Midwestern cities, because they have been going down a decent amount in the past 10 years or so. But I do think Milwaukee's making an upswing, and there are some big things going on right now. So it'll be interesting to see in about 5 years how the city looks. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and consider subscribing to this channel if you're interested in learning more about stuff like this. I'm talking about cities and states, and if you're a bit of a nerd, you'll like this channel because I'm a nerd too. But thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support, especially Asa from Des Moines. And if you're interested in supporting the channel or purchasing a pin for the viewer pin map, check out my Patreon page, link below. But as always, thank you for your support.